Good evening, everyone. Welcome to In Conversation Live with Chris Hopson, Chief Strategy Officer at NHS England. Welcome, Chris. And me, Gillian Leng, Dean of the Royal Society of Medicine. And we've got an hour to talk and lots of things to cover. And if you're watching online, please do add any of your own questions to the Q&A, and I'll do my best to include them. It'll be more fun, more interactive if you join in. Chris, you became a very familiar voice during the pandemic, and sometimes it seemed as though you were on the Today programme almost every morning. You were at that point the Chief Executive of NHS Providers and very much thrown into the spotlight. And we'll come back to your COVID experience, obviously, and also get your thoughts on the NHS pressures at the moment, the crisis we're facing as described in the media. But first, I want to take us backwards to your early life. I think you grew up in Newbury in Berkshire, and am I right in thinking you were the product of two big business families? Perhaps you could tell us a bit about that.
Yes, well, good evening, Gillian, and good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, everybody, for coming along virtually this evening. So I was born in, in fact, I was born in Oxford in the old JR, the old John Ratcliffe, but actually we were a Newbury family, and yes, it was two big businesses. It was Elliott's of Newbury, which were a furniture manufacturer, which was my mother's side of the family, and the factory made gliders during the war, and then basically moved on to furniture manufacturing. And then on my father's side of the house, Joseph Hopson's furniture store and Alfred Camp's drapery bazaar combined in 1921 to create Camp Hopson, which is one of those fantastic independent department stores that you see scattered around the country. And the deal was sealed by the fact that Winifred Camp, who was my grandmother, married Paul Hopson, my grandfather. So yes, it was in the sense that was a marriage of two Newbury businesses, but at my mother and father's level, it was also a marriage of two Newbury businesses. So I kind of come from a fairly prosperous and I think privileged, actually, business background because of that.
So no healthcare in that mixture at all, no experience of healthcare in your family?
No experience of healthcare. Obviously, consumers and customers, as it were, and patients of healthcare, but actually no healthcare professionals.
So what did you think you wanted to be when you grew up? Did you think you were going to go into the family business?
Well, I think it's really interesting, isn't it, when you are in kind of part of a family business, because there is always an interesting kind of pressure about what does happen, who does join the family business or not. As it happens, my brother is my elder brother, and effectively he did the proper kind of training to join the business, and he then joined. I always kind of, from a relatively early age, was always very interested in the kind of combination of kind of politics and public service. And certainly my dad, really interestingly, my father always believed that the business, the department store, of which he was the chief executive and then chairman, he always believed that it wasn't just a business that was there to make money for its shareholders. It was actually very much a public service to the people of Newbury. And he was a great believer in putting things back into the community. So he was a local commissioner for the Inland Revenue, which might crop up a bit later, my HMRC days, but he was also, chair of the local business building society. He just believed that part of his role was effectively to make a contribution to the broader community in Newbury. So that sense of public service was there really right from the beginning.
That's interesting. Just digressing for a moment, there was an event at the Royal Society of Medicine today about inequalities, and the role of businesses in supporting their local community came up as a potential thing that we should be encouraging.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. I think I've been lucky in all of my career. I remember going back to my Granada days, which we might cover a bit later, about just the importance of businesses playing an appropriate role in broader society. And I think one of the things we spent a lot of time thinking about at Granada is actually, how do you do that? I was very pleased to play a role as to be the corporate responsibility champion in HMRC, and thinking about how did that, admittedly not a business, more of a public service, but how did it play its role in the communities in which it was a part?
And there were some businesses, some families like Cadbury's, weren't there? And
yeah.
There in Bradford, they did a huge amount for their workers.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if you kind of go back, there was a very proud record, isn't there? You know, Lever Brothers in Port Sunlight, but also, you know, as you say, Cadbury's in Bourneville, a whole bunch of things. John Lewis is another very good example. If you kind of go back to the department store trade, you know, John Spedden Lewis, who set up John Lewis, was very adamant about his role as an employer. And, you know, playing a role in the local community. And again, sorry, not trying to make artificial links, but one of the things that I think has been really interesting has been the way in which over the last 5, 6, 7 years, actually, foundation trusts and trusts have been thinking about how do they play their role as anchor institutions within their local communities. I mean, they are often the biggest employer. And actually, one of the things I think it's really important for people to think about when you lead an organization like a foundation trust or a trust is actually, you know, they're so much part of their local community, not just as healthcare providers, but actually, as I said, as, for example, large employers, as purchasers, for example, of local services, you know, thinking carefully about what is it that if you are a leader of that kind of organization that you can do in the broader community.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about the scale of them and the potential impact that an FT can have. But I'm going to go back to you for a moment, because we got to you growing up, and then I think you went to study politics at the University of Sussex. So what were you thinking at that point? I mean, you were a good student.
No, well, interestingly, Gillian, I actually went to study history.
Oh, right, okay.
No, it's right. You're right. So basically, but it was very, very clear to me very, very quickly that it was going to be a very solid diet of left-wing history. So I sort of thought, so, you know, the first set book, understandably, the great E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class, I actually decided, and Sussex was great in allowing you to swap course. So actually I thought, well, if I'm going to have the left-wing politics, I'll have it pure, thank you. So effectively transferred a kind of across to politics, and actually had a really, really good time. Fascinating place. You know, like lots of people, I think, really enjoyed a huge amount, both in terms of obviously the university itself, but also doing a whole bunch of extracurricular activities, particularly student politics.
On the left side of the fence, by the sound of it.
No, actually, funnily enough, and again, you know, as I was about to get into my first job, actually, it was for the SDP, you know, David Owen's SDP at the time. So I was regarded, Gillian, as the far right wing on campus. So basically, the question at Sussex really was, which brand of left-wing politics were you? And there was you know, as you probably know, in kind of student politics of the day, there were sort of 93 different small groups on the far left, but the SDP, as far as Sussex was concerned, was definitely the far right.
That's interesting. So not surprisingly then, you moved from that to work in government, and I think I'm right in saying you were on the high potential civil servant scheme in the 1980s. So was it like working on the set of Yes Minister?
So you've jumped a bit, but yes. So
sorry, what did I miss?
That's fine. No, that's fine. No. So I basically did a period in kind of party politics, and actually ended up being, I was a constituency agent to start with, then ended up being director of elections and campaigns, and then was actually in David Owen's SDP. I was actually the chief executive, the party chief executive, at the point when David Owen's SDP was a going concern. But you may remember, those of you who've got history back in the early 90s, that horse died. So yes, I later on in my career, I then basically went to work at HMRC, and as part of that, had the opportunity to do a fantastic piece of development, which I thought the civil service did really, really well, which was the high potential development scheme, and effectively an opportunity to do some development with a bunch of really, really interesting people. So some of the people on my cohort was Julian Kelly, who's now the Chief Finance Officer at NHS England, Shona Dunn, who is the second permanent secretary at the Department of Health. I'm pretty sure Chris Wormold was also on our cohort. So yes, really good opportunity. What was it like? I think you're right to identify that, you know, it's an interesting experience. I would argue to you that HMRC is probably, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, was probably a slightly atypical kind of organisation in terms of, you know, it's a big delivery department. It has, I think, significantly less ministerial contact than you would expect for, you know, a DWP, a Foreign Office, a Home Secretary, a Home Office. So, you know, but yeah, really, really interesting experience.
So the high potential scheme that you were talking about and the individuals that you met and you got to know through that. Is there anything that the health service should learn from that?
Well, interesting question, Gillian, because I felt quite strongly. One of the things that I found really interesting when I joined NHS Providers is that one of the first things that came up really quickly was that we didn't have an adequate pipeline of senior leaders effectively to do those really, to do the Trust and Foundation Trust Chief Executive. We haven't, and rightly haven't got, and shouldn't have a heroic model of leadership where a kind of sort of, it all revolves around the chief exec. But there is no doubt that having the right quality of chief executive for these really big organizations, I mean, some of them, we're talking about, turning over an annual budget of a couple of billion. We're talking about, 15, 20,000 staff. Having the right leadership is really important. So were you to ask me what the proudest achievement of in the NHS, I have to say the creation of an equivalent of the high potential development scheme in the NHS, where we created the Aspiring Chief Executives Programme, where a combination of, and these names might mean something to some people, but it was a combination of Jan Sobirai from the Leadership Academy, Stephen Hay from NHS Improvement, and David Flory at NHS, the TDA, the Trust Development Authority. The four of us basically created this Aspiring CEOs Programme, very kindly got funding from NHS Improvement and the TDA. And effectively, Gillian, I couldn't be prouder of the fact that 30, I think it is now, of those graduates are now in provider or ICB, or in Navina Evans's case, national organisation chief executive roles. And I think for me, the importance of leadership development in a structured way, I think is really important. And again, if you allow me to hobby for 20 more seconds, I think a recognition that actually leadership development isn't just sheep dipping in a kind of sort of set curriculum. It's actually about creating an environment where you can learn from a really good set of peers. That's what I particularly picked up from the High Potential Development Scheme, where actually most of the learning, I would argue, came from interaction with a bunch of fantastic peers. All of that stuff feels to me to be really, really important. So yes, focusing on and creating the right environment in which you can do serious high quality leadership development seems fundamental to me.
No, I absolutely agree. And sort of reflecting back on old TV programs, I mentioned Yes Minister. Do you remember one called Troubleshooter? John Harvey Jones used to go around different industries and advise on what they should do. And he found healthcare by far the most complicated, with a whole range of factors that you couldn't do anything about. Do you remember?
I do remember it. And interestingly, as a bit of a follow-up to that, you may remember that there was a bit of a follow-up series done by a man called Jerry Robinson, who basically exactly kind of looked at healthcare. And interestingly, Jerry was my chair when I was at Granada. So I spent a period in the TV industry in between doing the politics and joining HMRC. And interestingly, he was kind of really focusing on some interesting issues even then, like, for example, theatre utilisation being a very good example of where, if you invest in your kind of key physical assets, ensuring that you make best use of them is really, really important.
Yeah, indeed. And as you've mentioned, Granada, let's turn to that for a moment. I think it was in the 1990s, you were the corporate affairs director at Granada. It sounds like it was a different path that you decided to take, was it? How did that come about?
No, well, it basically came about because I'd been a political advisor for a period inside the Department of what was then National Heritage, and got absolutely fascinated by the TV industry, and had worked after I left I then worked for a consultancy for a period who had Granada as a client, and they were looking for a corporate affairs director. So I sort of tentatively put my hand up and said, well, how about me? And actually got to work with Granada at a very interesting point where, again, those of you who are a little older may remember that ITV was 15 different separate franchises, and effectively Granada was the 5th largest, and there was clearly going to be a period of consolidation inside the inside ITV, and we went from, in the end, 15 different franchisees. I mean, Scotland still remains separate, STV still remains separate, but effectively down to one franchisee, and there was a series of takeovers. So I worked incredibly closely with my opposite number at a company called Carlton Communications, and then there was a sort of battle for the last piece of ITV, which actually Granada won. But I had a very pleasant time for 2 or 3 years working with my opposite number, who's a man whose name you might have heard of, called Gillian, called David Cameron, who went on to much better and grander things than I did later on in my career. But yeah, I spent 2 or 3 years actually working very closely with David, and pretty much enjoyed it, actually.
Interesting. So did that role in any way prepare you for your future media work?
I think one of the things that's really interesting when you work with a TV company is, so 2 or 3 things. One is you obviously kind of learn some of the mechanics about TV, and there is something deeply fascinating, I think, about what a television camera kind of ends up doing to people, and learning to kind of interact with what is just a piece of inanimate equipment, just watching absolute kind of past masters. Like, I mean, I'll never forget, I mean, one of the great privileges was, for example, being able to be in the studio when Cilla Black and people like that were actually kind of recording, and you could just see this kind of incredibly intimate relationship between these performers and the camera. And I think the second bit, I suppose, I really pulled out of the TV industry is the importance of talent. That effectively, you can only achieve what you want to achieve if you are able to attract, support, develop, retain really, really kind of bright people. And I felt certainly my leadership. I thought of the leadership task in a completely different way, having worked in a company like that, where if Ed has said, talent attraction, talent development, talent retention was just absolutely fundamental to the success of the organization.
Interesting. So I was going to move on to what you did at NHS Providers, but have I missed out any key bits of your life that you'd like?
No. So basically, I left Granada because, again, so we're sort of trying to plot this really weird journey. You and I were joking before in terms of just kind of the sheer sort of range of things that I've done. There is a bit of a consistency, is it's always tended to be communication strategy. It always tends to have a kind of bit of a public service bent, but I had great fun at Granada, really enjoyed it. It was a company that was absolutely on the up, but in the end, I just kind of felt it was a bit like a donut in terms of there was a bit of a hole at the center in terms of, not the company, but just my view of it was that I wanted to do more than just earn money for shareholders. And I therefore kind of felt I wanted to move to the public sector. So using my kind of communications expertise, I basically went to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs for a 7-year period, and really, again, sort of seeing government kind of close up. But also the bit I particularly learned that I think became relevant later on is I had quite a heavy duty operational role. So effectively, the last job I did from HMRC was I was customer contact director. So managing 12,500 staff across the country, 20 different contact centers, some of which had about 1,500 seats in them, 100 million phone calls a year, and just that real kind of sense of being accountable and responsible for the delivery of a kind of key public service. And again, one of the things I feel quite strongly is that you only ever know things in your career if you've been there and done that. And I have to say, I don't think I'd be anywhere near as effective as I hopefully am in terms of the NHS had I not had that experience of what's it actually like day in, day out, leading a very large group of people trying to deliver a really important public service, and being perfectly honest about it, times when we were really, really struggling. And one of the things I found really quite difficult was we were not able to provide for a number of different reasons, the quality of service to inbound phone calls that we wanted. So actually, some of our tax credit claimants weren't able to, potentially put food on the table for their kids. And I think that concept of, if you're leading a public service in which you need to provide the right quality of service, working out how, when you're not able to provide that quality of service, how you improve it, but also actually, if you don't mind me saying, psychologically about how you deal with the fact that actually you're not providing the service that you would ideally want to. So I found that was absolutely fascinating. And then, yes, you're right, Gillian, I then moved to NHS Providers. So sorry, probably a rather long answer to that bit of the question.
No, but the HMRC stuff is interesting, and it's fascinating to hear how you speak of its important role, which obviously it has, because most of us probably just associate it with, that annual cycle of tax.
Yeah. And again, I think it's really, I do think it's really interesting. I mean, there's a bit of a joke, isn't there, about having kind of been responsible on the board at HMRC for bringing all the money in. It was kind of quite interesting to flip on the other side and see how it was actually being spent. But what was, I think, particularly interesting, one of the things that I really, really found fascinating at HMRC is the way in which we were, using digital to completely transform what we were doing. So as an example, when I joined HMRC, we literally seemed to be rekeying every single paper self-assessment form. So you used to fill out your self-assessment form, we used to rekey it, enter the data on. And what we did in that, actually literally just as I was arriving, is we just basically moved self-assessment online, we moved PAYE online, we moved VAT online, a whole load of really kind of quite complex digital developments, but in which we fundamentally transformed the way in which we were providing the service. And, we were, I think, fairly widely acknowledged to be one of the leaders across Whitehall in terms of doing that process. So again, I think another element in which having had the opportunity to really see kind of close up about exactly how you drive change. And the other bit that I think is also particularly interesting that I, again, also enjoyed was we were really focused on using lean management techniques. And again, you can use the words continuous improvement, however you want to particularly use it. But again, so if you give me literally, again, if I can hobby for 20 seconds, the bit that was absolutely fascinating is that if you run a customer contact operation, the thing that you need to realize very, very quickly is you are mostly creating the unnecessary contact by things that you do yourself. So if you're talking to tax credit claimants, either by letter or usually by letter, then actually if you write those tax credit claimant letters in, a language that, can only be understood by somebody with a degree, which is what we were doing, then surprise, 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 you are generating literally hundreds of thousands of unnecessary contacts. So that whole concept of how do you redesign a public service to effectively take account of the needs of the individual who is in receipt of that service, we did a huge amount of really good work to do that. And the key to it was listening incredibly carefully to your frontline staff, because if you wanted to know which bit of gobbledygook was actually causing the most calls, the people who knew the answer were absolutely your frontline staff. So how you actually, and again, I've seen this absolutely in operation in the NHS, how do you actually create a system in which you can enable your staff day in, day out to make those what might seem small improvements, but actually can make huge differences. But you've got to create a system in which they are able to generate that change themselves rather than have to wait for approval to kind of come from above. And again, if you go to places like West Sussex, if you go to some of the places where we've introduced this kind of continuous improvement approach, you can see really quickly about how much a difference it can make.
Absolutely right, because there's nothing more frustrating, is there, on the front line, knowing what change needs to happen and not having the ability to do it yourself. And there's a read across your comment there about sending out letters that are gobbledygook with what sometimes happens in the health service, where patients get information. They might get the letter that's been written for another health professional, but have no ability to understand what them.
Yeah, and And I think one of the things that really interests me, Gillian, is how do we kind of develop our thinking about what we think of the NHS? And I think part of it, I think a very, very big part of it is about the quality of care that we receive. But when I listen to people and I say, what do you think is wrong with the NHS? What you quite often get back, it feels to me perfectly legitimately, because we've all been on the end of it, is effectively, it's quite often the join up between the different bits and some of the admin stuff where effectively, you know, we're getting letters after, and then Royal Mail strikes don't really help. We're getting letters after actually we've had the appointment. We don't have the ability like you do in some other parts of your life to be able to, you know, use digital to book your own appointments, change them, etc. And I do think there is a fundamental, a really important opportunity to kind of use that combination of data, digital, but also allowing staff to actually kind of drive changes to the day-to-day patient or minute-by-minute patient pathway, less in terms of, you know, the actual clinical treatment, but actually more some of the admin around it. You know, I think there's some fantastic opportunities really very quickly to get a significant improvement in the patient experience, because I think a lot of people's frustrations come from, you know, some of those interactions.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree. So being chief exec of NHS Providers, was that from 2012? I think you took.
Yeah, so from 2012, what an absolutely amazing opportunity for somebody who hadn't been in the world of health. But I think I was appointed because I had, I think, a good understanding of how government worked, a good understanding, I think, of, you know, how a membership organisation might work. But the privilege to basically be able to support and to be the public voice of a set of organisations as important as the 200 and what at the time was about 235 acute community mental health and ambulance trusts, an absolutely, you know, amazing kind of privilege. And you know, you always have to ask yourself the question, don't you, Gillian, about what gets you out of bed in the morning. And what used to get me out of bed in the morning was the sense of if there's the opportunity to do something every day that just made those leadership teams of those organizations, made their job just a tiny bit easier. I kind of felt that was what really, you know, I mean, just extraordinary organizations doing extraordinary things, anything that I could do to kind of help them, you know, help make their job easier. It's a fantastic opportunity. So, yeah, I mean, a fantastic job that I really, really enjoyed.
And that was well before we'd imagined the pandemic, wasn't it? So at that point, when you started out at NHS Providers, what did you think was the biggest challenge facing the NHS?
Now, that's a great question, Gillian. I'll tell you what I kind of felt I kind of picked up really quite quickly. There were 2 or 3 things that, you know, and when you look back, by the way, you know, if you look back about where we were performing, the idea that we had virtually every trust that was in, you know, kind of surplus, they were all making their 5%. Potentially, you know, surpluses to reinvest in capital, etc. It was just a different era. But you could see there were 2 or 3 things that were underlying that were a worry. One was definitely this sense of we were still very much focused on being a national illness treatment service. And if you remember, we'd had the Wanless report when the government put that extra money in, and they were the Labour government at the time had put that money in and basically said the sustainability of the service absolutely depends upon moving more towards, in terms of, you know, being better at prevention. And I think even then you could see we were finding it difficult to kind of make you know, the progress that we needed to. The second bit, which struck me really quite quickly, because I happened to bump into my German colleague, so, you know, the German Hospital Association, and we were comparing notes, and I was talking about our bed occupancy levels, and the guys from Germany just couldn't understand it. They said, well, how on earth are you running your hospitals at 92, 93 kind of % capacity when you know, and we know, that actually 85% is the kind of bed occupancy level that you need to maximize efficiency, provide the best quality of care, but also give yourself some kind of scope for, you know, coping with small shocks that inevitably kind of come along. So you could see then that there were some issues that were coming. The bit that you couldn't see at that point was then effectively this interesting decade between 2010 and 2020, when there definitely has been a significant mismatch between the growth of demand and our ability to grow capacity to keep up with it.
Yeah, it's reminded me of some of the nice things, because at NICE, the One List report gave us a public health programme. And NICE also used to use a slide showing about 6 people in a hospital bed, reflecting that NICE's role was working out which patient would go in and which one would have to come out based on cost effectiveness. Well, Chris, it's 8 o'clock, the hour's flown by, and thank you so much for your time, Chris. It's been a pleasure talking to you, a fascinating conversation, so much more we could say, and thanks to everyone who joined down the line. And finally, please note that there will be another in the In Conversation Live series with Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, 6 p.m. on Wednesday, the 25th of January. But thanks again, Chris. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you, Gillian. I very much enjoyed it. Thank you
very much. Goodbye, everyone.